He stood in the corner of the apparatus bay, holding a mop, eyes down, invisible by design. The other firefighters barely noticed him anymore. That was exactly how he wanted it. His name was on no plaques. His face was in no photos. He showed up, he cleaned, he filled tanks, he disappeared. For 3 years, nobody asked questions. Nobody cared enough to ask. Then the Marines arrived, a full combat unit, responding to the same mass casualty event, rolling in hard and fast, and their sergeant, a decorated veteran with 2 tours in Fallujah, stopped mid-stride in the middle of chaos, turned, and looked directly at the man with the mop. Then he snapped to attention and saluted. Every firefighter on shift froze. Nobody moved, nobody breathed, because nobody had any idea who that man actually was. His name was Daniel Reeves, and what happened next would change everything they thought they knew about the quiet man who filled their water tanks. 3 years. That is how long Daniel Reeves had worked at Station 14 in Hargrove County without anyone knowing his real name. Not his full name. Not his real name. They called him Danny. Some of the younger guys called him Old Danny, which they thought was funny because he was only 41. He smiled at that. He let them have it. He let them have everything they wanted to say about him because he had decided, long before he ever walked through the door of that firehouse, that he was done being seen. He had come to Hargrove County from nowhere, or at least that was how it seemed. He had applied for the civilian support position, maintenance, equipment logistics, water tender operations, and the battalion chief at the time, a broad-shouldered man named Chief Garrett Holt, had looked at his application for about 30 seconds before sliding it back across the desk. "You have a gap," Chief Holt had said. 12 years. What were you doing?" "Working," Daniel had said. "So, doing what?" "Different things." Chief Holt had studied him. Daniel had held the man's gaze without blinking, without shifting, without giving anything away. It was a skill. The kind of skill you either had or you didn't, and the kind of skill that took a very specific kind of life to develop. Chief Holt had hired him anyway, though nobody could quite explain why. The chief had told his lieutenant afterward that there was something about the man that made him feel like turning him away would be a mistake he'd regret. He couldn't explain that. He just felt it. Daniel had started the following Monday. He had arrived 15 minutes early, found the supply closet without being shown where it was, selected the appropriate mop for the type of flooring in the apparatus bay, and started cleaning. When the morning crew arrived, he was already done with the bay and moving to the equipment room. Nobody introduced themselves. Nobody said good morning. He was maintenance. He was support staff. He was invisible, and he moved through the firehouse like a ghost who had chosen his haunting carefully. The crew of Station 14 were not bad people. That needs to be said plainly. They were not cruel or malicious or deliberately unkind. They were firefighters in a mid-sized county department, overworked and underpaid, and dealing with the particular brand of exhaustion that came from watching people on the worst days of their lives, day after day, year after year. They had their own world, their own language, their own hierarchy. And Daniel Reeves was not part of it. He was fine with that. He was more than fine with that. He had built his invisibility the way a craftsman builds something important, deliberately, carefully, with attention to every detail. He kept his head down. He never offered opinions. When conversations happened around him, he became part of the furniture. When someone needed something found, he had already anticipated it and placed it where it needed to be. When equipment came back from a call dirty or damaged, he assessed, cleaned, repaired, or flagged it for replacement before anyone had to ask. He was exceptional at being unremarkable. The firefighters noticed his competence in the abstract way that people notice oxygen. It was there. It kept things functioning. It was not interesting. The one who came closest to noticing Daniel as an actual human being was a young firefighter named Marco Estrada, 24 years old, 3 years on the job, still young enough to be curious about everything. Marco had a habit of talking to people that most of the crew considered background noise, which included Danny from maintenance. "You ever think about taking the firefighter test?" Marco had asked him once, maybe 6 months into Daniel's time at the station. They had been in the equipment room, Marco restocking a kit, Daniel reorganizing the shelving system he had been quietly improving for weeks. "No," Daniel had said. "Why not? You know this place better than half the crew." Knowing where things are isn't the same as knowing what to do with them. Marco had laughed. Fair enough. He had gone back to his restocking. Daniel had gone back to his shelving. And that had been the end of it. But Marco had noticed something in that moment that he could not name and did not pursue. Something in the way Danny had said that. Not defensive, not dismissive, just precise, careful. The way someone speaks when they are choosing their words with intention rather than just filling space. It had nagged at Marco for a day or two, and then the job had swallowed it whole, the way the job swallowed everything. That had been 2.5 years ago. Now it was a Tuesday in October, and the call came in at 14:17. Daniel heard the tones drop while he was in the storage room behind the apparatus bay, doing an inventory of compressed air cylinders. He listened to the dispatch. His hands stopped moving. Multi-vehicle collision on Interstate 82 near the mile marker 63 overpass. Reports of a tanker truck involved, possible fuel spill, structural compromise of the overpass, multiple casualties, mass casualty protocol activated. He stood completely still for 3 seconds. Then his hands started moving again, but differently, faster, more deliberate. He walked to the apparatus bay as the crew was gearing up and rolling. He watched them go. He watched the engines pull out, lights and sirens, the beautiful organized chaos of professional emergency response. He stood in the empty bay as the noise faded. Then he went to his locker. Most of the crew did not know Daniel had a locker. It was not in the main locker room. It was a secondary storage locker in the equipment maintenance area, the kind of plain metal cabinet that nobody paid attention to because it looked like it held spare parts. It did hold spare parts. It also held other things. He opened it. He looked at what was inside for a moment. He closed it again. He went back to his inventory. 40 minutes later, the radio traffic changed. He was listening to the department frequency. He always listened, always, a habit so deep it had become biological. And he heard the change before the words caught up to the tone. The voices got faster. The pauses between transmissions got shorter. Someone used a word they were not supposed to use on the air, and someone else did not correct them. Then, the update came through on the station radio. Secondary collapse. Section of the overpass had given way. Multiple responders trapped under debris. Civilian casualties now estimated at 17 or more. A gasoline tanker had ruptured and fuel was spreading. Fire was possible. The adjacent structure, a transit maintenance facility, had taken damage, and there were reports of people trapped inside the building as well as on the collapsed roadway. And then, cutting through the radio traffic like something from a different world entirely, came a frequency Daniel had not heard in years. He had a scanner in the equipment room, tucked behind a row of spare SCBA masks where nobody would think to look. He heard the military tactical frequency come alive. The Marines were coming. He stood there for a long moment. The scanner crackled with controlled, clipped communication. He recognized the cadence before he recognized the words. He knew exactly what unit it was from the way they talked, the specific compression of information into the smallest number of syllables, the way each transmission ended with a certainty that was almost physical. 2.5 minutes later, he opened his locker again. This time, he did not close it. The scene at mile marker 63 was controlled chaos teetering on the edge of uncontrolled chaos. Engine companies and rescue units had established a perimeter. The fuel spill had been contained on one side, but was still spreading on the other. There were 7 confirmed fatalities on the collapsed roadway, 11 critical injuries, and an unknown number of people still trapped in the debris of the overpass section and the transit facility. Battalion Chief Holt was running command from the staging area, and he was doing it well, the way he always did things, with methodical competence and the particular kind of calm that came from having been in bad situations before. But this was beyond bad situations. This was the kind of event that used up resources faster than they could be replaced, that created new problems at the rate of 1 per minute, that had the specific texture of a situation that could get dramatically worse before it got better. The Marine convoy arrived at 14:58, 6 vehicles, 24 personnel. A rapid response team from a reserve unit 20 minutes away that had been activated through an emergency mutual aid protocol that most civilian departments had never actually used before. Their commanding officer was a sergeant named Victor Cruz, 37 years old. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. He had the kind of face that had been trained to show nothing and had gotten very good at it. He stepped out of the lead vehicle and immediately began a visual assessment of the scene, his eyes moving in the specific pattern of someone who had assessed scenes like this before, in places where the consequences of a wrong assessment were immediate and permanent. Chief Holt moved to meet him. They shook hands. Cruz was already talking, fast and direct, asking questions that told Holt immediately that this man knew exactly what he was doing. They were moving toward the command post together when Cruz stopped. Dead stop. Mid-stride. Holt walked 2 more steps before he realized Cruz had halted, and he turned back confused. Cruz was looking at the apparatus bay staging area where additional equipment had been brought from Station 14. And standing next to a water tender, doing something with a pressure coupling that his hands knew how to do without his eyes needing to supervise it, was Daniel Reeves. Daniel had his back to them. He did not know he was being looked at. Cruz covered the distance between them in 9 steps. His pace was not a walk. It was not quite a run. It was something in between that communicated urgency without panic. He stopped 2 feet behind Daniel. Daniel turned around. For a moment, neither man moved. Then, Sergeant Victor Cruz, United States Marine Corps, combat veteran, a man who had not shown an uncontrolled emotion in the field in 15 years, came to attention. Full attention, precise, formal, complete, and he saluted. "Commander," he said. The word dropped into the noise of the scene and created a pocket of silence around itself that spread outward like a ripple. Firefighters nearby stopped, heads turned. Marco Estrada, who had been hauling equipment 30 feet away, went completely still. Daniel looked at Cruz for a long moment. His expression did not change. Then, very quietly, he said, "As you were, Sergeant." Cruz came out of the salute. His expression was not exactly awe. It was something more complex than that, recognition, relief, and something that looked very much like gratitude that Daniel Reeves had shown up to this particular disaster on this particular day. "Sir," Cruz said, lower now, almost private despite the chaos around them, "the south section of that structure has 3 of mine and at least 8 civilians trapped under a secondary collapse zone. My team can get there, but we cannot get them out. The debris configuration, I saw it from the road," Daniel said. He was already moving. "How long since the secondary collapse?" 22 minutes. "Anyone with crush injuries?" 2 confirmed, possibly more." "Walk with me." He moved toward Chief Holt as he said it, and Cruz fell into step beside him with the automatic precision of someone who had learned to move in formation and had never quite stopped. Holt watched them coming and felt something shift in the air that he could not explain, the same feeling he'd had when he hired this man 3 years ago, now amplified to a frequency he could feel in his teeth. Chief, Daniel said, arriving at the command post as if he had always been expected there. "I need 5 minutes of your time and then I need access to your command structure." Holt stared at him. "Danny, what? I'll explain everything you need to know in those 5 minutes, Daniel said. "But I need them now, because he glanced at his watch. "Roughly 40 minutes, anyone in that debris field with a crush injury is going to start experiencing reperfusion injuries that will kill them faster than the debris will. And there are 2 people in there who fit that profile." The silence stretched for exactly 2 seconds. "Talk," Chief Holt said. His name was not just Daniel Reeves. It had been once. Then it had become Commander Daniel Reeves, United States Navy, attached to a Joint Special Operations Task Force with a designation that had never appeared in any public document. Before that, it had been Lieutenant Commander Reeves, before that Lieutenant Reeves, before that Ensign Reeves, fresh out of Annapolis with a degree in mechanical engineering and a secondary qualification in emergency medicine that he had pursued because something in him had always been drawn toward the broken and the fixable. He had served for 17 years. In that time, he had been in 6 conflict zones, participated in 43 combat search and rescue operations, been personally responsible for the extraction of 27 personnel from situations that official documentation described as non-survivable, and developed a methodology for debris field rescue under fire that had been quietly adopted as standard training material for 3 branches of the military without his name ever being attached to it. He had left the Navy 3 years ago, and the circumstances of his leaving were complicated. and the weight of those circumstances was something he carried in his chest like a stone that had become part of his anatomy. His last mission. He had briefed it 31 times in his head since then, going over every decision, every second, every choice that had seemed right at the time and had turned out to be catastrophically wrong. 8 personnel. A rescue operation in a location that does not have a name in any unclassified document. A structural collapse that nobody had predicted from the intelligence they had been given. 4 had made it out. 4 had not. Daniel had been the last one extracted, and he had been extracted against his explicit orders to his team, orders he had given lying pinned under 800 pounds of rubble with a fractured collarbone and 3 broken ribs. He had ordered his team to leave him and get the others out, and his team had disobeyed him because they were Marines and Navy and Special Operations, and they did not leave people, not ever, not for any reason. All 4 survivors had made it. He had made it. The other 4 had not. The review board had cleared him. Every decision he had made had been assessed as correct given the available information. There had been no negligence, no failure of planning, no breach of protocol. The board had cleared him completely and had then offered him promotion. He had resigned his commission instead. Because a review board could tell you that you had done everything right, and you could still know, in the part of yourself that could not be reviewed or cleared or promoted, that 4 people had trusted you with their lives and you had come home without them. He had come to Hargrove County because it was far away from anything that knew him. He had taken the maintenance job because it let him stay close to emergency response, close enough to watch, close enough to help in small ways, close enough to feel that he was still in the business of keeping people alive, even if nobody knew it, without being in a position where he was responsible for outcomes, without being in a position where people depended on him and he could fail them again. That had been the plan. He explained none of this to Chief Holt in those 5 minutes. What he explained was operational. Debris field structure, crush injury timeline, the specific technical approach that his methodology used for sequential extrication from a compound collapse zone, the medical protocols that needed to be running in parallel with the physical extraction, the coordination structure between military and civilian teams that would allow them to work the site simultaneously without creating interference patterns that could destabilize the debris. Holt listened. He did not interrupt. He was the kind of commander who understood when someone else in the room was the most qualified person to be talking, and he had the ego security to let that happen. When Daniel finished, Holt was quiet for 4 seconds. "How do you know all this?" he asked. "Because I've done it before," Daniel said. "Multiple times, under worse conditions." Another pause. "What do you need?" It was 21 words. Everything changed in 21 words. What followed was 53 minutes of work that the firefighters of Station 14 would describe later in individual conversations, in ways that all contained the same central impossible element, the certainty that they had watched someone function at a level that they did not know was available to human beings. Daniel did not take command in a way that displaced Chief Holt. He was too tactically intelligent for that. He moved alongside the command structure, enhancing it, filling gaps, anticipating needs before they became requests. He coordinated the Marine team with the rescue companies with a fluency that came from years of doing exactly this kind of multi-unit integration, and he did it without anyone feeling managed or diminished. He moved through the debris field with Cruz's team and 2 rescue firefighters, including Marco Estrada, who had been assigned to the group before anyone thought to consider that he was young and the situation was extreme. Marco moved beside Daniel through the rubble and found himself doing something he had never done in 3 years on the job. He found himself following someone else's lead instinctively, without question, without hesitation, the way you follow someone who simply and obviously knows exactly where they are going and why. "Here," Daniel said, stopping at a section of collapsed concrete and steel that looked identical to every other section of collapsed concrete and steel. "There are 2 people under this, approximately here and here." He indicated 2 positions with a precision that suggested he was working from information nobody else could see. "The one on the left has been in compression for," check of the watch, "26 minutes. We start there. Cruz, I need your team on the secondary stabilization points here, here, and here. Marco, you're with me on primary extrication." "How do you know someone's there?" Marco said. He did not mean it as a challenge. He meant it as a genuine question, the kind he had always asked because he was still young enough to need to understand things. Structural analysis and sound, Daniel said. Listen. Marco listened. He heard nothing but the noise of the scene around them. I don't, he started. The rebar on the left side of that section has a resonance pattern that changes when there's a mass underneath it. The change is approximately 4 Hz different from an empty section. You learn to hear it. He looked at Marco directly. You will learn to hear it too if you stay in this work long enough. Now, move. They moved. The first extraction took 11 minutes. A 43-year-old transit worker named Ramon Figueroa, who'd been pinned under a section of collapsed ceiling with a compression injury to his right leg that was precisely as far along the injury timeline as Daniel had predicted. When they got him clear, the EMTs were already positioned exactly where Daniel had told them to be, with exactly the medical intervention protocol he had specified, and Ramon Figueroa's blood pressure, which had been in freefall, was stabilized before the next crisis had time to announce itself. The second extraction was harder. The woman's name was Elena Marsh, 31 years old. She had been in the transit facility for a meeting that was supposed to take 45 minutes. She had been in compression for 31 minutes when they reached her, and the injury pattern was more complex than Ramon's, and there was a secondary debris shift that required Daniel to make 3 rapid decisions in sequence, each one building on the last, each one correct in a way that Marco Estrada was watching with a feeling in his chest that he could not name and did not have time to examine. At one point, a section of the debris they were working around shifted. It moved perhaps 4 inches, but 4 inches in a compound collapse zone is a communication from physics that everything is about to change. 2 of Cruz's Marines flinched back. One of the firefighters on the outer team called out a warning. Daniel did not move. He assessed the shift in the time it took to draw a breath, calculated what it meant for the structural integrity of the section, determined that the movement had actually improved their access angle by a factor that outweighed the destabilization risk, and communicated this in 4 words. Hold, continue, we're good. And then he went back to work. Elena Marsh came out of the debris at the 47-minute mark. She was conscious. She was in pain. She was alive. When they brought her to the medical staging area, she looked at Daniel through the haze of shock and pain and adrenaline, and she said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "You stayed." "I stayed," he said. Something crossed his face then, something that Marco, standing 2 feet away, saw and could not look away from. Not grief exactly, not pain exactly. Something older than both. Something that had been sitting in a man's chest for 3 years and had just, in this moment, shifted half an inch from where it had been living. The total count for the incident, when all the numbers were finally written down in the reports that would be filed and reviewed and cited in training materials for years, 23 personnel extracted alive. 2 had died before any response could reach them. Of those extracted, every single person with a time-critical crush injury had survived, which was a statistic that the county medical examiner later described in a report that was not widely circulated as medically improbable without exceptional intervention. When it was over, when the scene was secured and the last of the medical transports had cleared and the debris field was locked down for structural engineering assessment, Chief Holt found Daniel at the water tender, doing exactly what he had been doing when Cruz had first seen him, working with a pressure coupling, hands moving without needing supervision from his eyes. Holt stood next to him for a moment without speaking. "Tell me," Holt said finally. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he told him. Not everything. He would never tell anyone everything, because some things belonged only to the 4 people who had not come home, and the least he could do for them was to not turn their deaths into a story he told. But he told Holt enough. The service, the methodology he had developed, the operation that had ended his career, the review board that had cleared him, the resignation that had followed anyway. Holt listened the way he had listened to the operational briefing, completely, without interruption, giving the information the respect of his full attention. When Daniel finished, Holt was quiet for a long time. 3 years, he said finally. Yes. You've been here 3 years and you've been... He stopped. Started again. We had you cleaning floors. I asked for that job, Daniel said. I applied for that specific position. I needed... He stopped, looked at the pressure coupling in his hands. I needed to be somewhere where nobody's life depended on whether I got it right. Holt was quiet. I understand that, he said, and his voice had something in it that was not sympathy and was not pity. It was the voice of someone who understood that some things could not be argued with, only waited out. I understand why you needed that. A pause. But Danny, he said, and there was something in the way he said the name that was not quite the name that had been chosen for its smallness. I think you got it right today. Daniel did not respond to that. But something in his posture changed, and Holt, who was a man who understood bodies and what they communicated, saw it and said nothing. Cruz found him 20 minutes later. The sergeant approached with the specific directness of someone who had something to say, and was going to say it without the kind of circling that civilians sometimes did around difficult conversations. "Sir," he said, "I owe you a conversation I should have opened differently." "You opened it fine," Daniel said. "I should have asked before I—" Cruz paused. "I knew you were trying to be away from all of this. The salute was an instinct. I should have controlled it better." "Victor," Daniel said, and the use of the first name did something to Cruz's posture, softened something that had been military straight. "You saved 7 minutes of convincing by doing what you did. I might not have moved fast enough otherwise." Cruz looked at him. "I think you would have," he said. "I think once the tones dropped and you heard what it was, there was only one way this was going. I just maybe helped you remember that sooner." Silence. "Your team did well today," Daniel said. "They had a good coordinator. They had good training. That comes from their sergeant." Cruz acknowledged this with a slight nod, the way you accept a statement of fact rather than a compliment. "There's something I was asked to pass along," Cruz said, reaching into his uniform. He produced a card. Plain. Official letterhead. A name and a contact at the Naval Reserve Emergency Response Coordination Office. "They've been building a new program, Joint Civilian-Military Rapid Response Integration. They need someone who has done both worlds, someone who can build the bridge." Daniel looked at the card without taking it. "That's a very specific description," he said. "Yes, sir," Cruz said. "It is." He held the card out and waited. Daniel took it. He looked at it for a moment, then he slipped it into his pocket. "Tell them I'll think about it," he said. Cruz allowed himself the smallest possible smile. "I'll tell them you said that, sir. They'll know what it means." The drive back to Station 14 was quiet. The crew of Engine 3 rode mostly in silence, the specific silence of people processing something that had not yet been fully understood. Marco Estrada sat in the back and stared out the window and turned things over in his mind. He was thinking about the debris field. He was thinking about the way Daniel had moved through it, the way he had known where to look and what to listen for, and how to make decisions in the fractional seconds that decisions were available. He was thinking about what that kind of knowledge cost, not in effort or training or time, in something deeper, the kind of cost that left a mark you couldn't see but that changed the way a person held themselves in a room. He was thinking about a man who had carried an extraordinary capability into a firehouse and spent 3 years deliberately not using it. He was thinking about what it meant that the capability had come back anyway. When they reached the station, Daniel was already there. He had ridden back in the support vehicle, arrived first, and was doing what he always did after a call that involved the department's equipment. He was checking things, assessing, making sure everything was accounted for and properly stored and ready for the next time it was needed. Marco walked over to him. He did not know what he was going to say. He opened his mouth and what came out was not what he expected. "I've been here 3 years," Marco said, "and I think I've been wasting them." Daniel looked at him. His expression was not quite a smile, and not quite not a smile. "You've been learning," Daniel said. "That's not wasting. You learned more in 17 years than I'm going to learn in a career." "That depends entirely on what you decide to pay attention to," Daniel said, "and whether you're willing to learn from things that are hard to look at." Marco was quiet for a moment. "The way you knew where those people were," he said. "The sound thing. The resonance." "Yes? Can you actually teach that?" Daniel was quiet for long enough that Marco thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Find me tomorrow morning, before the shift change. I'll show you what to listen for." Marco nodded, turned to go, stopped. "Danny," he said. "Yes. What do you want us to call you?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Daniel," he said. "I think I'd like to go back to being called Daniel." Chief Holt submitted a formal commendation that night. He cited Daniel Reeves by his full name and former rank in the document because he felt that partial credit was a form of disrespect, and Garrett Holt was not a man who disrespected people who had earned what they had earned. The commendation noted Commander Daniel Reeves's exceptional leadership, technical expertise, and direct contribution to the survival of 14 individuals during the 82 overpass incident, and recommended that the department review its personnel classifications and consider whether its civilian support staff might include individuals whose capabilities exceeded their current designations. It was, in the careful language of official documents, a gentle way of saying, "We did not look at this man. We should have. We will look now." The card from the Naval Reserve Emergency Response Coordination Office sat on Daniel's kitchen table that night. He made coffee. He stood at the window and looked at the dark outside and listened to the quiet, which was different from the quiet he had been keeping for 3 years. This quiet had a different weight, not lighter exactly, more honest. He thought about Elena Marsh saying you stayed. He thought about Victor Cruz's face in the moment of recognition. He thought about Marco Estrada asking if resonance could be taught. He thought about 4 names he would carry for the rest of his life. He always would. He had accepted, in some part of himself, that carrying them was not the same as being stopped by them, that the obligation was not to be paralyzed by what had happened, but to use what he knew, everything he had paid for, everything that had been paid for him, in service of the people who were still here and still needing what he could give. He picked up the card. He thought about it for a long time. Then he picked up his phone. 6 months later, Station 14 had a new position on its organizational chart. It had been created in consultation with the county, the State Emergency Management Office, and the Naval Reserve Emergency Response Coordination Unit. The position had never existed before in any civilian department in the state. It was called Technical Operations and Integration Commander, and it was designed for exactly the kind of expertise that could coordinate civilian and military rapid response in mass casualty events, and the person who held it was required to have both worlds in their background, and the salary was frankly embarrassing for the level of qualification required, and Daniel Reeves had accepted it anyway. He still arrived early. He still knew where everything was before anyone asked. He still moved through the firehouse in a way that some of the newer crew found slightly uncanny, the specific feeling of being in the presence of someone whose awareness extended further than a normal person's awareness extended. The difference was that now, when something happened, when the tones dropped and the call came in and the apparatus bay filled with motion and noise and the organized, beautiful chaos of people running toward what everyone else ran from, Daniel Reeves no longer stood in the back and watched them go. He went with them. Marco Estrada could now identify the resonance change in rebar under load that indicated a trapped mass beneath debris. He had practiced it in controlled environments and then in 2 real calls in the months that followed the overpass incident, and both times he had been right. And both times it had mattered. He had started asking questions that made his training officers slightly uncomfortable, because they were questions they did not know the answers to, and he had started going to Daniel before and after every significant call, not to be taught in any formal sense, but in the older sense, the way knowledge transferred before there were classrooms, by proximity and attention and the willingness to be shown things you did not previously know how to see. Victor Cruz's unit ran the first joint exercise with Station 14's crews 4 months after the overpass incident. It was built on the integration protocol that Daniel had used that day, formalized into a training framework that Cruz and Daniel had developed together over 3 early mornings and 2 very long phone calls. The after-action report from that exercise was forwarded to 6 other departments and 2 military units. It was described in the dry language of official assessment as a potentially significant advancement in joint civilian-military rapid response capability. In the language of the people who had been at mile marker 63 on a Tuesday in October, it was described differently. It was described as what happens when you stop overlooking the person in the corner and start asking what they actually know. The 4 names he carried never became lighter. He had stopped expecting them to. But the weight had changed in character. It was no longer only grief, It was also purpose, the specific purpose of someone who had been given, by the unlikely grace of a Marine sergeant's recognition and a debris field, and a woman who said you stayed, the chance to keep doing the work that the people who were gone had trusted him to know how to do. That was what he owed them. That was what he paid. Every shift, every call. Every morning he arrived before the crew and walked through a firehouse that now knew his name. All of it. For them. Here is what Daniel Reeves's story asks you to hold on to. The person you have overlooked the longest may be the one most capable of changing everything. Not because they arrived that way, but because they have been shaped by experiences you cannot see, paying costs you have not been asked to pay, carrying knowledge that only comes from going through things most people are never required to survive. Hiding is sometimes the only form of healing available, but healing, when it is real, eventually reaches an edge. And at that edge, what was carried in secret becomes what can be given openly. If you are the person in the corner, the one who stepped back because the weight of what you have been through felt too heavy to carry into the light, know this: the moment will come. Not because you announce yourself, but because something will need exactly what you have. And when it does, the question is not whether you are capable. You already know the answer to that. The question is whether you will let yourself be seen. And if you are standing in that firehouse, surrounded by the competent and the committed, but somehow missing the one person whose presence would change everything, look again. Look at the quiet ones. Ask what they know. Because the most important person in the room is sometimes the one holding the mop. If this story hit you somewhere real, leave a comment below and tell us, who is the person in your life that everyone overlooked? And if you know someone who needs to hear that their past prepared them rather than disqualified them, share this with them today. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't already, because every week we bring you stories like Daniel's, stories of people who carried extraordinary things quietly and then showed the world exactly what quiet can hold.